to recap, Part 1, Mustafa Barzani spent his infancy and early years being imprisoned by the Ottoman Empire. As a teenager, he joined the 1919 Kurdish uprising and later on participated in the 1931-32 revolt. He led the 1943 revolt, commanded the Peshmerga under the Iran crisis, and returned to Iraq in 1958 following General Qasim's coup. However, things between Qasim and Barzani fell apart, and the First Iraqi-Kurdish War broke out in 1961. There would be heavy fighting where the Kurds pretty much held their ground and defeated Qasim's offensives, and in 1963 Iraq witnessed two coups and Arif came to power, where there would be a ceasefire from 1964 to 1966 until Arif died in a helicopter crash. Then Arif's brother ruled Iraq, and some more fighting continued until Arif and Barzani both wanted peace. However, Arif's time as president came to an end in 1968. In July 1968, the Ba'ath Party, supported by the army, overthrew Arif's government and assumed control over Iraq, returning Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr back to power. The Ba'ath Party realized the toll the military operations in Iraq against the Kurds were taking and signals its willingness to settle the Kurdish issue peacefully. The Ba'athists initially hoped to seek an agreement with the Talabani Ahmed faction to bypass Barzani. However, Barzani then entered into hostilities with the government once again and shelled the city of Kirkuk in March of 1969. The Ba'athist government restarted a campaign to end the Kurdish insurrection, which stalled in 1969. This can be partially attributed to the Shah of Iran supplying the Kurds with weapons and ammunition. With the Iranian help, the Kurds decisively defeated the Iraqi advances, and Barzani's receipt of aid from Iran posed challenges for the Ba'athist government and complicated their military efforts within the region. Furthermore, the internal power struggle in Baghdad also greatly hindered Iraqi progress, as well as the fact that the Soviet Union began pressuring Iraq to come to terms. By May of 1969, the government indicated that it was willing to negotiate with Barzani, which then began formal negotiations by December of that year. Barzani demanded that the Ba'athists sever ties with the pro-Iraqi government Kurds as well as the Ahmed Talabani faction, and recognize the sole power within the KDP, as well as autonomy of the Iraqi-Kurdish region to be discussed. With Mahmoud Othman conducting negotiations on behalf of the Kurds and Saddam Hussein on behalf of the Iraqi government, an agreement was reached on March 11, 1970. The final terms of the agreement recognized the Kurdish people and considered the Kurdish language a second official language of Iraq along with Arabic, along with further autonomy in northern Iraq excluding the city of Kirkuk, in exchange for full control over the Iraqi army in Kurdistan. The agreement would stipulate the creation of an autonomous region consisting of 3 Kurdish governorates, and other adjacent districts would also have to be determined by a census to have a Kurdish majority. The plan also gave the Kurds representation in government bodies to be implemented within the next 4 years. For the time, it seemed like this was the most serious attempt to resolve the long-running Iraqi-Kurdish conflict. The Ba'athist government began reconstruction in northern Iraq and worked towards creating the autonomous region, appointing 5 Kurdish men to junior-level ministries in the government, as well as incorporating the Kurds along with the Iraqi Communist Party into the National Front, provided Barzani with a stipend to manage the KDP, as well as the Ahmed and Talabani factions would also reunite with the KDP, so things appeared to be going pretty well. Within a month of signing, most articles were implemented, and by December, Mullah Mustafa Barzani was optimistic about autonomy. However, by the end of the year, it became clear that the Ba'ath Party was just playing for time, as there was an attempt on Barzani's son's life, and relations quickly began to deteriorate as the Ba'athists were continuing Arabification efforts to decrease Kurdish standings in contested cities such as Kirkuk and not being committed to genuine autonomy. And in September of 1971, an assassination attempt took place against Barzani when he was receiving religious officials in his headquarters. The clerics had thought they were carrying suitcases with recording devices for the benefit of Baghdad. However, they had instead been wired with explosives. The explosion did not kill Barzani, but it did kill others participating in the meeting, and in the confusion, Peshmerga guards rushed in and killed the cleric. Government drivers who drove the clerics tried to salvage the assassination attempt by tossing a grenade in and killing a Peshmerga and wounding 12 others, but it missed Barzani before they themselves were shot and killed. Although the conspirators were not captured, Barzani attributed responsibility for the attack to Saddam Hussein, who knew about the attempt. A few more disputes with the Ba'ath regime later, Barzani maintained open borders with Iran, allowing the continued flow of arms and supplies, which increased the following Soviet-Iraqi Treaty of Friendship in 1972, once the U.S. was also concerned about Iraq entering the Soviet sphere of influence. Israel would also increase support to Barzani, hoping to frustrate Ba'athist Iraq. These actions would strengthen Barzani's forces, but led to criticism from some factions within the KDP and leftist groups supporting the Kurdish causes in Iraq. Barzani's own son, Ubaydullah, would defect from the KDP and preferred to cooperate with Baghdad. Through March of 1973, Barzani would begin to rebuild and reorganize the Peshmerga in anticipation of another war with Baghdad. And on March 11, 1974, the Ba'athist government would pass the autonomy law, which it would be presented to Barzani for approval. However, Kirkuk was not included, and his faith in the Ba'athists for a genuine autonomy was low, therefore Barzani rejected the agreement. Following this rejection, Ubaydullah would fully defect to Baghdad. Barzani had viewed the proposal by the Iraqi government as a ploy to divide Kurdish lands and undermine their negotiating position, leading to him to declaring a resumption of armed struggle by early April 1974. And this decision would mark a strategic pivot from guerrilla tactics to more conventional mobilization, reflecting an overconfidence in external backing for an underestimation of the Iraqi military superiority. Barzani would rally 50 to 60,000 Peshmerga fighters for the KDP command and organize them into structured units for frontal assaults rather than hit-and-run operations. This would expose his inherent logistical issues as he didn't have artillery or armor. While achieving initial territorial gains such as overrunning Iraqi positions and destroying several battalions in surprise offensives in March and April, these successes would not be a common thing, as he was hampered by the Peshmerga's reliance on small arms and mountain terrain advantages, which would be insufficient against Iraqi mechanized divisions. Again, in April of 1974, Iraqi forces initiated a major counteroffensive against the Peshmerga in positions seized earlier that year, including Zakho, and they deployed reinforced divisions that overwhelmed Kurdish defenders through superior conventional firepower and numbers. Peshmerga attempted symmetrical warfare by holding fixed lines in mountainous terrains and would suffer heavy casualties at the hands of Iraqi artillery and infantry advances. However, a rare Kurdish tactical success occurred at Kaladais near Soleimania, where the Peshmerga were entrenched on the high ground and used mortars, snipers, and terrain advantages to repel Iraqi assaults, and reportedly achieved a 20 or 30 to 1 enemy-to-kill friendly fire ratio. However, this defense proved isolated, and by September of that year, Iraqi operations had recaptured most Kurdish-held towns and marked a shift as sustained offensives would erode Peshmerga cohesion. Autumn engagements around Shishar would see artillery barrages shatter the Kurdish forward lines and forced retreats which exposed their flanks, and in the winter of 1974 to 75, there would be temporary stalemates due to harsh winters. However, Iraqi forces broke through with flanking movements and prompted widespread Peshmerga desertions and collapse in discipline as supply lines would falter. Iraqi forces, benefiting from conventional military superiority, would deploy substantial troop concentrations with 30 infantry brigades and special forces units alongside key fronts in Kurdistan, and they would be supplied by the Soviet armored vehicles such as the T-55 and T-62, as well as heavy artillery, aerial assets such as MiG-21 fighters, and these resources enabled systematic operations against roughly 30,000 Peshmerga fighters who relied on irregular tactics at this point. The Iraqi strategy emphasized overwhelming firepower to dislodge insurgents from mountainous strongholds while minimizing direct engagements in unfavorable terrain. Again, back in autumn 1974, Iraqi units would advance through critical mountain passes that were contested by Kurdish forces. The reclaiming operations would incorporate scorched earth measures such as village destruction, resource denial, as well as other means to undermine Kurdish logistics and civilian support networks. Furthermore, airstrikes and artillery barrages would facilitate ground advances, with Iraqi engineering units improvising and improving access to roads to enable mechanized assaults, though casualty rates would remain high due to ambushes. By early 1975, these efforts had restored Iraqi control over most disputed territories in northern Iraq. These advances by the Iraqi government, as well as limitations of the insurgency against the Ba'athists, would see the Iraqi forces secure most oil-rich areas and strategic corridors, which set the stage for negotiating settlements amid Kurdish setbacks. There were also allegations of chemical weapons used, but these lacked much verification from neutral observers. Iran and Iraq would sign the Algiers Accord in 1975, which stipulated that Iran ended support for the Peshmerga and would no longer be supporting supplies and transport of armaments to other countries, which spelled an end for Barzani's rebellion, as it could no longer keep the Peshmerga supplied. On March 23rd, just a few days after the agreement was finalized, Barzani and nearly 100,000 followers would leave Iraq for Iran and ended their insurrection against Iraq to allow the Ba'ath Party to implement its assimilation policies towards the Kurds. Ahmad and Talabani, along with their supporters in the established Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, or PUK, in June of 1975, would criticize Barzani and the KDP for what they described as the inability of the feudalist, tribalist, bourgeoisie, rightist, and capitulationist Kurdish leadership. Barzani and his family were settled near Tehran, and the KDP went through the chaotic period in its attempt to reorganize itself in the face of defeat at the hands of the Ba'athist government. Barzani and his aides would continue trying to gain support from the United States, seeing that the Soviet Union had settled for amicable relations with the new government in Iraq. American support for the Kurdish movement appeared to be primarily strategic, and it focused on countering Iraq's influence rather than advancing the Kurdish nationalistic goals. Barzani lived to witness significant geopolitical changes, which included the overthrow of the Shah, the departure of Henry Kissinger after Gerald Ford's defeat in the 1976 U.S. presidential election. He also witnessed the death of Algerian President Houri Balmendini, all of which influenced the Kurdish struggle. Seeking to treat lung cancer, Barzani would go to the United States, where he would die on March 1, 1979, at Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, D.C., as he underwent treatment. Barzani was buried in Iranian Kurdistan after his body was flown back from the United States, and in October of 1993, his remains were brought across the border from Iran to Iraqi Kurdistan as he was reburied in his hometown of Barzan. His son, Masoud Barzani, was the leader of the KDP and was re-elected as the president of Iraqi Kurdistan in the region with 66% of the popular vote in July of 2009. And his grandson, Nechirvan Barzani, was the prime minister of Iraqi Kurdistan. And that is the end of part 2 of the story of Mustafa Barzani. What other Middle Eastern figures would you like for me to cover? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.